Okay. Good morning. Okay, we said we spoke about beards for a bunch of weeks, and we said we're gonna move on to hair. Now, talking about hair is gonna include, in my estimation, it will include Chassidish haircuts, Sai for men, Sai for women. But before we get to that, maybe upsharons, all the various different haircut-related things. Before we get to that, I wanted to talk about naziris a little bit, which is the opposite of a haircut. It's growing your hair very long. It happens to be that it works out that we just learned about it on Shabbos, so it's an opportune time to talk about it. Now, when I started looking into naziris, I did not realize how many nazirim there were, even in the relatively recent tkufa. I thought that naziris was much, much more rare, and certainly bizmanenu it's very rare, but there's a lot to see, a lot of different tshuvas in the Gedei Achronim and interesting fights and stories and etc. And we'll try to get to them. But just as a way of introduction, I came across a tshuva from the Minchas Yitzchak that I think the tshuva itself I'm not going to go into b'chlal, but the shayil just gives you a little bit of like a picture in what naziris bizman hazeh would look like. The shayil writes as follows. He says, here's the shayil. The shayil is on he says as follows: B'hiyosi b'Mumbai Haidu. When I was in Mumbai, India, after several years of traveling amongst different idol worshippers, I showed up to a shul on Erev Rosh Hashanah. This is in the year Tafshin Lamed Vav, I guess that's 1976. When I heard the piyut Oiked v'haneked v'mizbeach, paratzti b'bechi rav, I started crying. I made a achlata she'en li makam acher ki im b'yadus. I'm not going to join any other religion. I'm only going to stay in the Jewish faith. This is an Israeli, one of these like backpackers, in India. He says that, notwithstanding the fact that I have no knowledge what Yahadus is, but I set myself to it, I turned myself around, and I went home to Eretz Yisrael. He says, Parshas Lech Lecha, I got home to Tel Aviv, to my parents' house. I taught myself Chumash and Nach in the house. He says, I never went to a shul, I never put on tefillin, I was just doing this on my own. He says, while I was sitting in my parents' household, I was mekabel on myself a naziris, where he says, in like the vein of an Indian Avodah Zarah worship, of growing your hair long, I was mekabel naziris, like in the vein of Indian Avodah Zarah worship. He says, then I had no idea what was included in naziris. Lag ba'omer that year, he says, Nasisi l'miron. I went to Miron to Rav Shimon ben Yochai, Bikarti b'kol ha'kvaris. I went to all the kvarim that are in the Izur of Rav Shimon ben Yochai, Thomas Meis. Then it says, Chag HaShavuos, he spent with a group of people on Har HaBayis who only believe in Teresh B'chsav. It's a fascinating little trip through all the different types of religious experiences. Then he walked from Yerushalayim to Hebron. He says wearing sandals, tzitzis, and big baggy pants. He's describing his journey. And then eventually he does bump into people who know more. And then he says, L'maisa, now I finally became from for real, and I know what naziris is. And he says, Pashat shematzavi hayoyim lahisi mekabel shum naziris v'darim rishonim. In my current status, how I am today, I would never have been mekabel on myself any naziris or weird things. The yesha naziris machvidalai. It's getting hard for me. B'china gashmis v'ruchnius v'chevratit. It's hard for me from a ruchnistic standpoint, the gashmistic standpoint, societal standpoint. Just like friends. I'm afraid I won't be able to get my kids into school if I'm a nazir. Is there anything you could do to be matir when it is? Now the tshuva is like a 10-page tshuva where the Minchas Yitzchak goes into the whole, what exactly a naziris is, a nazir shimshin, bizmanenu, the nadarim aspects of it, the Kabbalah aspects of it. He goes into it very deeply. But I think the shaila really encapsulates what a naziris bizman hazeh would look like. It would look like something that would make sure your kids don't get into school. B, it's kind of like a weird religious experience that's not, within the norm or whatever. So I wanted to just see, was it always like that? Did it change sometime in the middle? What exactly is it? What exactly would naziris look like bizman hazeh? Now, I would be remiss if I didn't mention that in the previous generation, there was a famous rabbi in Eretz Yisrael. His name was Rav David Cohn. He was one of the primary Talmidim of Rav Kook. He was one of the Reshivas of Merkaz Harav. He was a Nazir. There's pictures available of him. He died in 1972, so it's relatively recently. He was a nazir from 1914, be'erich, I don't know, 1920, all the way until 1972. So he did a 50-year stint of nazirus in the very recent modern time. There's pictures of him with his long hair and his long beard. Actually, as a young man, like with a black beard, he looks striking. Like it's like long, sharp black hair, like jet black hair down to his shoulders. It's a piercing look as a young man. Eventually he gets older and it's gray and all sorts of colors. He actually has a famous son-in-law. Rabbi Goren was his son-in-law. He was a very spiritual person, a heilige person who wanted to do, wanted a lot of ruchnius and whatever, meaning that was his bikush, his muvukash over here. But Lamaisi, he was a very unique person. He was a very different person. He was not exactly someone you'd call fitting into the mold. He actually was an enikel of the Rav of Radin. Chavetz Chaim was not the Rav of Radin. Chavetz Chaim had a yeshiva in Radin. The Rav of Radin was someone by the name of Rabbi Katz. That was his grandfather. He bounced around all the Litvish yeshivas. He learned in Radin, he learned in Slobodka, he learned in Volozhin. And then at a certain point, he goes to college for a doctorate in philosophy. In 1914, he gets kicked out of Germany. He ends up in Basel, Switzerland. By chance, he meets Rav Kook in Basel, who was also exiled there during World War I. He becomes, crazy attached to him, and then he becomes a nazir and a vegetarian. At a certain point, when the East Jerusalem was captured by the Jordanians in 1948, he makes a neder not to leave his house, and he stays in his house from 1948 until 1967. I think with two exceptions, that he was not the neder, like to attend things that he couldn't miss. So you wouldn't call him a traditional. You wouldn't call him a traditional rabbi, but I have to mention that there was this nazir who was, relatively well known. He was called the Rav Nazir. There's many svarim. He was a prolific mechaber svarim. He wrote a sefer called Koil Nevuah, which is very popular. In it, he describes that the reason why he was a nazir was because he was hoping that if he would reach elevated spiritual, levels, he'd be able to become a navi. He wanted to become a navi, which is something that Klal Yisrael hasn't had in, give or take 2,500 years or whatever it is. So, definitely a very interesting spiritual experience that he was going through. He was a nazir. Now, Lamaisa, I found that in his son's sefer, his son was a rav in Haifa for the Rabbanut. Rogatchover Gaon was a famous rav in Eretz Yisrael, a very regular rav. He writes that and this tells us a little bit about his father, he writes that when he was 12 years old, which is the age of Mufla Samach La'ish, like Abin Nidarim, Nivdakim. The din is that a neder that a child makes when he's 12 years old, you have to check it out. It's not something to just disregard. So he said his father became concerned that at 12 years old, maybe Rogatchover at that point was also being noig ben Naziris like his father. He was raised by his father, he was being noig ben Naziris. His father was concerned that at 12 years old it becomes a neder for his son. Naziris is like all the nedarim, becomes a neder for his son, it's going to be a problem. So he had like a strange bar mitzvah of gathering Rabbanim in the house together to be Meiser Moidah, that it's not a neder, so that he could shave his head whenever he wants. And I think Lamaisi, he kept his long hair until he was about 16, and then he shaved his hair. But at this Mesiras Moidah, which was attended by Rabbi Zalman Meltzer, incidentally, amongst other Rabbanim, the name that we would be familiar with, Rabbi Zalman Meltzer, attended this Bittul Naziris, whatever you want to call it. Sai the father and Sai the son both announced that the Ba'atzim, the Naziris, is not a Naziris at all. All it is like Chulun al Taras HaKodesh, where they're noyig minhagei Nazirus, even though they're not makabel Naziris in themselves as a neder. So this is the most known case of someone being a Nazir recently, but again, according to his own Bahidas Piv, he was not actually a Nazir. He was just, Chulun al Taras HaKodesh, he was being noyig like a Nazir. Now, before I handle the sugi of Naziris, I just want to mention one other famous person. I'm sure everyone has seen a picture of the Rogatchover. Right, the Rogatchover has it's like a helmet of hair, right? Like it comes out till here, like a huge helmet of hair. And I think I grew up always hearing, and some other people did also, that the Rogatchover didn't want to waste time taking haircuts. When you take off a yarmulke to take a haircut, you can't be Yosef B'Torah. And the Rogatchover was so davuk in his learning, he didn't want to, take off his yarmulke to take a haircut, and therefore he took haircuts very sporadically, and Mameli had very long hair. And this is something that comes from Reb Shlomo Yosef Zevin in his Sefer Ishim V'Shitas. He's the one who says this, and they think this is famous. Now the problem is that if you look in the Shulchan Aruch, the halacha is that you're allowed to be mahar b'Torah when you're not wearing a yarmulke. You're not allowed to learn Torah or speak Torah when you're not wearing a yarmulke. You're allowed to be mahar b'Torah. So certainly the Rogatchover knew a lot of learning Baal Peh, and he could have been mahar b'Torah if he wanted while he was getting a haircut. So there were some who said, and this is like a debunked fake science thing, that the hair is like connected to the brain, and someone who has a very big brain, it's very painful for them to take a haircut. This is like a very debunked type of science. It's obviously not either why the Rogatchover didn't take a haircut. Now, some say in Chabad there's a Mesorah that the Rogatchover, when he was a 5-year-old boy, went with his father to the Rebbe, the Tzemach Tzedek. That was his father's Rebbe. And the Tzemach Tzedek met this boy. He was obviously a very impressive boy, a genius, a Chad B'daradik, a genius. And Tzemach Tzedek asked his son, Rabbi Yehuda Leib, who later on becomes the Rebbe of Chabad Kapust, which is like an offshoot of Chabad, who was actually, the Rogatchover was a Kapusta Chassid. He tells his son, Rabbi Yehuda Leib, put your hands on his head and give him a bracha that he should be zeichet to lamdus. And fine, so Rabbi Yehuda Leib gives him bracha, he should be zeichet to lamdus, from his father, the Tzemach Tzedek. And then Tzemach Tzedek tells him, and you should learn nazir. So when they leave, the Rogatchover turns to his father and he says, what did the Rebbe want from us? What was he telling me to learn? What was he talking about? So he says, the Rebbe told you should be gebenched with lamdus. So he meant you should start with nazir. All right, he's telling you to learn, so start with nazir. So he said, no, it's not mistaver. The Rebbe told me I should be benched with lamdus. That means everything. Lamdus means kol terakula. I should know how to learn everything. Why is he telling me I should learn nazir? And a day later, the Rogatchover comes back to his father and he says, obviously what the Rebbe meant was that I should become a nazir. And becoming a nazir, without knowing all the pratei dinim of nazirus is stam stupid. So he was telling me, learn nazir very well because you're going to become a nazir. This is a story that's brought down in different, books. The Riyatz, the previous Chabad Lubavitcher Rebbe, seems to have mentioned it at some point, have said it over. So there's like a Mesorah in Chabad, Kilu, that the Rogatchover was a nazir of sorts. Now again, you can't really become a nazir at 5 years old. That's not Nidar Nivdakim yet. Only Shimshon was able to become a nazir as a baby. But there is a Mesorah that the Rogatchover was a nazir. Others say that he had a issue with his scalp, and it was very painful for him to take haircuts. It's just interesting that there is a Mesorah in the world that based on a bracha that the Rogatchover got from Tzemach Tzedek, that he was a nazir. Now, so what is nazir b'zman hazeh? Is it desirable? Is it b'diavad? Meaning, it's certainly uncommon. Is it like a b'diavad thing, or is it a desirable thing? So Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky actually has a very interesting vart in last week's parasha, Amos Yaakov, literally just this week. Rabbi Yaakov says as follows. He says the pasuk, when it talks about a nazir not becoming tamei, the pasuk says la'aviv u'le'imay la'achav u'la'achayse la'yetame. When the pasuk describes that a nazir is not to become tamei meis, it says la'aviv u'le'imay la'achav u'la'achayse. So the Rabbi Yaakov wants to know, why doesn't it talk about his children? Normally, some of the craving that a person is allowed to be allowed to or not allowed to be mitama to involves a son, a daughter, and a wife. Over here it just says la'aviv u'le'imay la'achav u'la'achayse. So Rabbi Yaakov suggests, this is a very interesting thing, Rabbi Yaakov suggests that nazirus was prevalent by Bachram. He says nazirus was common. He says mishum da nazirim hayu bachram. The pasuk says in Amos, ve'etem mi b'neichem l'neviim u'mi bachureichem l'nazirim. He says v'imkein adayin lahoyel benu bas. They didn't have sons and daughters. Nazirim didn't have sons and daughters. And then he takes it a step further. He says, you want to know why? He says, v'bir hadavar hu. The Gemara says that if someone's roya saita v'kakula, he should be mazir himself from yayin. Kelemer, kisharoya is kayach hakilkul shal yayin, u'mekabel alatzmi l'shanis darke b'chayim v'lasis siag al tavasi v'rtzei noisav. When a person sees, how bad taivas could go and how far things could go, he's makabel on himself to make siagim and to change his life around and to not be drawn in by taivas. He says, v'zed davar shekashem ma'od la'adam m'voger b'shanim. Old people can't turn their life around on a dime. I'm reading Rabbi Kamenetsky. Old people can't turn their life around on a dime. He says, Ki ein loy es ha-meretz hadarish l'shanas drachav al dichaysev akvun lo mizeh zman rav. An old person does not have what it takes inside of him to just turn his life around because of something that he sees. You see something tragic, you see something, scary. An older person can't just change his life around, he says. Avol nar ubachar, a young, a teenager, shadayin lekava darke b'chayim, loy kal b'harbi ligdar alatzmi lifresh mitanuga elam haza. That's a person who could still, make a commitment to turn his life around and make big changes. Even though Rabbi says, of course, it's pasha that an older person could be makabel on himself nazirus. It was very uncommon. This is Rabbi suggestion. He says it was so uncommon that a nazir should have a son and a daughter that the third didn't even have to go into the tumas mace of a son or a daughter by a nazir. And it brings Rabbi Yaakov a raya. This is not a very conclusive raya, but he brings a raya from a famous Gemara in Nedarim in the Haftas Beis that I want to just read for a second. It's one of the famous stories that the Gemara brings about Nazirim. It says as follows: Amr Shimon HaTzadik. Shimon HaTzadik says, "Miyamei lo yechalti Hashem nazir tamei." I never partook in the karbanis of a nazir. He says, "Elo echad, one time." Why? Because pamachas ba adam echad nazir min adarim. This a nazir from the Darom came. V'reisav shu yaf yifei einayim v'toiv roi. I imagine he looked like David Kohen, like the Rav Nazir, as a young man. He says, "I came and I saw that he has sharp eyes and a beautiful look. The kavtzeisiv sturim le'taltalim, and his hair was like curled down to his shoulders in like tight locks of hair." Amati le b'ni, ma reisav lahashchas sarecha zehana. How did you come to the decision to destroy this beautiful hair that you have? Amrli, he said, Roya ha'isi la'aba be'iri. I was a shepherd for my father in our city. Halachti l'males mayim and amayin. And I went to fill up water from the well. V'nistakalti b'babua shali. I looked at my reflection. Upachaz alay yitzri. And I became full of how I look. And I said, wow, you're like, you look really good. There's a lot you can do with this look. And ubikish l'tardeni min ha'olam wanted to cause me to be, to do averis and to be dragged out of this world. Amarti loy, I told myself, I told my reflection, Russia, lama ata mizgah ba'olam she'ena shalcha, b'misha hu asad li es rima v'teleya. What are you being mizgah in something that isn't yours, in a world that isn't yours? It says, ahavoida, I made a shvur right there, she'agalecha l'shamayim. I'm going to cut you off, meaning cut off the hair l'shamayim. Miyad, so Shimon HaTzadik says, Miyad amadati v'neshaktiv al roshi, I gave him a kiss on his head. Amarti le b'ni, my son, kamoicha yirbu naziris b'Yisrael. Alecha kasavayim ishki yaflu l'nder neder. So Rabbi Yaakov brings this Gemara as a raya. Rabbi Yaakov says this Gemara is a raya to what the proper framework for a nazir, what the proper situation that's supposed to have a nazir. He says like this: it's a young person who finds himself faced with the taivas of the world, and in a moment of inspiration, he's able to make a big turn in his life, make a change, and make a commitment. That's the classic case of a nazir. This is what Rabbi Yaakov says. Now, there is in the Gemara Alein, there's a shita of Rabbi Eliezer that says that a nazir is nikra chayta. A nazir is nikra chayta, and Rabbi Eliezer says there's many different places in Shas in regards to anybody who withholds from himself anything. Rabbi Eliezer says someone who fasts is nikra chayta. A nazir is nikra chayta, meaning someone who withholds from himself the hana selam haza when he doesn't have to, meaning the Torah is not mechayiv you to be a nazir or to have extra fast days or whatever. So the person's noider on himself and he withholds from himself extra things. Rabbi Eliezer says he's called a chayta. Now, the Rambam in Nechus Yisei the Atayra, not Nechus Naziris, the Rambam in Nechus Yisei the Atayra, when he says his famous word about extremes, right? The Rambam has a famous word. The Rambam says the proper way to do everything is the middle, the Shvil HaZahav, the middle route, right? The balanced way. But the Rambam says, and he brings Rabbi Eliezer Shita, that going to extreme one way or the other is detrimental. That's not the way to go. But the Rambam says that when do you find that going extreme is good? Is the mashal by someone who finds himself being pulled or being tugged too far to one side. So the Rambam says you make a correction and you go all the other way. It says, Kemai mishara sayda b'kachuli yazatzman mayayim. Meaning someone who sees himself being pulled too much to Taivas Elam Hazeh, being pulled too much, so he makes an Naziris and he pulls himself back. So the Rambam Kilu holds that as a general posture, Naziris we pass like a Vlaza Nikra Chayta, meaning it's not a desirable thing to be a Nazir, to withhold yourself, to cloister yourself like that and withhold yourself from Taivas Elam Hazeh. But if someone sees himself that he has a present need to do this, to correct himself, to create a correction in his life, he's allowed to do it. Other Rishonim, like the Ramban, hold that we don't pass like Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Eliezer that says Nikra Chayta is not how we pass. We hold it's an admirable thing. It's a very admirable thing to become a Nazir. And why is it called Chayta? Chayta is only when your Naziris ends. Because you did a Naziris for a timed amount of period and you didn't follow through with it for your whole life. You didn't stay on this high level that you committed to. That's when you're called the Chayta. Now, that's all kilu on the ideals of if it's kedai to be a nazir, if it's good to be a nazir, if it's like a desirable thing to be a nazir. Lamaisa, could you be a nazir b'zman hazeh? Meaning, givein loch, naziris involves karbanis, right? The end of naziris, in whatever format it will take, involves bringing karbanis. Whether you did it because you became tameh, whether you did it because you got to the end of your naziris, either way it involves karbanis. And now the Rambam says like this. The Rambam in Hilchos Naziris, in Perek Beis, Halacha Chaf, the Rambam says like this. Naziris noyeg, b'fnei habayis, v'shalei b'fnei habayis. Lefichach, someone who makes himself a nazir b'zman hazeh is a nazir forever. Since there is no Beis Hamikdash where a person can bring the karbanos that he's obligated to bring at the end of his nazirus, so he's a nazir forever. That's what the Rambam seems to pass him clearly, and many Rishonim agree with him. It's a whole list of Rishonim. Seems to be most Rishonim agree with the Rambam that a person could make himself a nazir. And the only nafkamin is that today you stay a nazir forever instead of being a nazir for a time frame because there is no karbanos to bring. Then the Ram continues and he says a very interesting detail. And this is something that maybe is not so known. The Ram says like this. Ein ha-naziris neheges el b'eretz Yisrael. Now there is no Gemara that says this. It's unclear where the Rambam got this from. Naziris is only noyeg in Eretz Yisrael, he says. Misha nazir b'chutz la'aretz, someone who became a nazir, made a neder of nazirus in chutz la'aretz, kainsin oisei, umechayvin oisei la'alas Eretz Yisrael, v'liyas nazir Eretz Yisrael. Communion Yom Nazir. We cancel him, we force him to go up to Eretz Yisrael and to live out his term of Nazirus in Eretz Yisrael. Lefichach, he says, Misha Nadir Bizman Hazeh b'chutz la'aretz. Anyone who makes a Nazirus Bizman Hazeh in chutz la'aretz, Kaifin oisei la'alas Eretz Yisrael, v'liyas noyeg shem Nazirus, ad sheyamos ad sheyiv na'amikdash v'yavik ha'marneisav v'loisim ein Israel. A person who chooses to become a Nazir Bizman Hazeh, we force him to go up to Eretz Yisrael and to live out the term of his Nazirus in Eretz Yisrael. Now, the Rogatchover didn't go to Eretz Yisrael. If the Rogatchover was a Nazir, and that's not so clear that he was a Nazir, but if he was a Nazir, he didn't go to Eretz Yisrael. And the Rogatchover Grada, as a matter of policy, paskins like the Rambam, traditionally always paskins like the Rambam. Rav David Kayin, the Kohen, the Rav Nazir, did go to Eretz Yisrael, just to keep track of this. But the Rambam seems to hold this din that you have to go to Eretz Yisrael. Now the Kesef Mishnah asks, the Kesef Mishnah asks that it's unclear where the Rambam got this from, where this din, like where this comes from, this din, that a person has to go to Eretz Yisrael, and he does not really have a good makar to explain where the Rambam got this from. Now, Lamaisa, there's a Ravid over here that throws a wrench in the whole sugya. The Ravid says like this. The Ravid says, Amar Avram, Lama kaifin oisei la'alis. Why do we force him to go to Eretz Yisrael? V'chi yesham taira? Is there taira in Eretz Yisrael more than there is in Chutz La'aretz? V'alei kulanu tmeim tomas meis. V'ein kan hefresh ben Eretz Yisrael l'Chutz La'aretz. And here's the punchline, v'asir lahazir b'chol makom. Says the Ravid, since we're tmeim wherever you go, you're tamei in Chutz La'aretz, tamei in Eretz Yisrael, you're not allowed to make an Nazirus anywhere. So now the Rambam had said, and a lot of Rishonim agree with him, that sure, a person can be Noid Nazirus wherever he is. Maybe there's stipulations, maybe you have to go to Eretz Yisrael, maybe you have to do something, but a person can be Noid Nazirus wherever he is. The Ravid says no, since there's Tumah, wherever you go, Sayin Chutz La'aretz, Sayin Eretz Yisrael, you're not allowed to make an Nazirus with Zanazeh. So now the Ravid's day is that because of the Tumah, which he holds is not unique to Chutz La'aretz at all. The Rambam seems to hold is unique Tumah to Chutz La'aretz, maybe Tumah Sa'amim, Tumah de Rabbanan, whatever it is. But the Ravid that doesn't hold like the Ravid holds, you can't be Noid Nazirus with Zanazeh. Now, how do we paskin? So it's not in Shulchan Aruch. The Shulchan Aruch doesn't bring down Nazirus with Zanazeh, not Nazirus with Zanazeh. There is a din in Shulchan Aruch, it's in Reish Lamed that says as follows. In Sifyud Beis, in Reish Lamed the Mechaber says like this. The Mechaber says, Amar Hareini Nazir, Hareini Nazir, Chalu Shneim, V'tzarech Linig Shnei Nazirus. Now, the Mechaber doesn't have a simon in Shulchan Aruch, or a bunch of simon in Shulchan Aruch called Hilchos Nazirus. So for some reason he leaves it out. But in the middle of Hilchos Nadarim, in Simon Reish Lamed Tes, the Mechaber says a din that clearly seems to imply that he holds Nazirus could very much be a viable option, but it's not Nazir. He says, Hareini Nazir, Chalu Shneim, V'tzarech Linig Shnei Nazirus, and a person has to accept both of those Nazirus on himself and keep both of them. Now the Shach in Sivkat and Chavchas over here notes this. The Shach says as follows. He says as follows: V'da, the Nazirus noyeg b'fnei abayis v'shalei b'fnei abayis bein ba'aretz bein b'chutz la'aretz. The Shach brings, like the Rambam, that Nazirus is noyeg bein ba'aretz bein b'chutz la'aretz bein b'zman hazeh, the whole thing. He says kedemuchach b'sei perek the Nazir. There's a raya from a Mishnah, fine, the Rambam, etc. Then the Shach goes, and I'm not going to read each one of them, but he brings about 10 different places where there's a diak in the Mechaber that the Mechaber holds the Nazirus b'zman hazeh. So for whatever reason, the Mechaber chose not to write it. Maybe because it wasn't prevalent. Maybe because it's fraught with many complications. Maybe the Mechaber wasn't advising it to become a Nazir b'zman hazeh. But the Mechaber, in many places, is clearly meduik. In the Shach, it's a long Shach with many diukim. The Mechaber clearly holds that the Shach holds like the Rambam that Nazirus is noyeg b'zman hazeh. Akavanim could be noyeg b'zman hazeh in its full glory. So now, seemingly the halacha is that Nazirus could be and is noyeg b'zman hazeh. So now, was Nazirus ever done? Besides for these few, eccentric cases that we're talking about, was Nazirus ever done? So now, if you look back in the L'mashal, for starters, the Halachas Ketanis, which is written like in the 1700s, the Halachas Ketanis, like in the 1700s, he writes that there's a minig by the Amaratzim, the Svardish Amaratzim, he writes, to just make themselves Nazirim at all times, to say, I'm a Nazir, I'm a Nazir, I'm a Nazir, and it's a terrible minig, they don't know what they're doing, and it should be disregarded. So now, aside from the fact that he's anti, but it does tell you that it was very done. Now, if you'll wind back the clock, the same Tkufa, the Chidah, brings a story about a Groisset Talmud Chacham that he met who was a Nazir. You wind the clock back a little more to like the Gedalia Svardish Aposkim, like in the Dar of the Shulchan Aruch, the Marit, the Marashtam, the Radvaz, the Maribei Rav. There's many occurrences of Nazirus being mentioned over there, and some of them are pro, some of them are anti, some of them let them off the hook easy, some of them don't let them off the hook easy. And there's a bunch of different types of Nazirus that are discussed. Additionally, there was one story, to me this was just interesting. Sometimes you look at it like a din like Nazirus, for example, and you think that it's not very relevant to day-to-day life. Meaning we're talking about a Rambam, a Ravid, a Hin, a Her, it's one of these sugyas. It's like a little bit like flyover country. So I did notice there's a Rambam in Perek Gimel in Hilchos Nazirus that talks about a sugya of Nazirus in regards to Nazir Shimshin. And if you look at the Kesef Mishnah, there's like a long Kesef Mishnah that brings a machlekes between the Maribe Rav and the Maral Bach and the Rebbe Leo Mizrahi, a bunch of names, and it's hard to know what's going on. And like I was looking at it a little, and then I tried to figure out what the story was. I looked at some of these chuvas, and it was like a tremendous fight in a kehila in Egypt that mamish hinged upon like this diik and a Rambam, like a sugya that all these acharim were discussing. And it just, it just was like interesting to me that nothing's really flyover country. Like you think this like a little machlekes acharim and how to learn this Rambam, like just like a blurb. It turns out that it was a huge community fight in Egypt in the early 1500s. I think I'm going to save it because it's worth its own discussion. It's a fight between mamish the Gedolei Hadar of that Tkufa. Maybe next week we'll continue that, and then we'll move on to shaving the heads.
You've just experienced another Torah class brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.